Good evening. Welcome to the second chapter of Adam Hamilton's book, 24 Hours That Changed the World. I think I'm going to do what I've done with the daily updates, is give about a minute and a half for folks to join in. So I'm going to play some instrumental music and then we'll start. I see some other folks have joined. I'm glad you could be with us tonight. So Reverend Adam Hamilton is the senior pastor at Church of the Resurrection in Leawood, Kansas, which I believe is the largest United Methodist congregation in the world, 22,000 members. He is 55 years old and one of the best known United Methodists in the world. He has written books about every aspect of the life of Jesus Christ, from his birth to his death to his resurrection. This particular book follows Jesus from the Last Supper to through the crucifixion in 7 chapters, and I'll be reading one chapter a night at 8 o'clock all the way through Saturday. Saturday night will be the last night, and this will include Thursday night, Maundy Thursday, and we're having a service at 7, and then I'll be reading at 8 o'clock. The Garden of Gethsemane. They went to a place called Gethsemane, Mark 14:32. Thursday night, across the Kidron Valley. Sometime after 11 o'clock on Thursday night, Jesus and his disciples concluded their Passover Seder by singing a hymn. We know the words they sang because this hymn, like the prayer Jesus spoke as he blessed the bread, is still a part of the Seder. It is called the Hallel, a word meaning praise. It is the root of our word hallelujah. And it is composed of selected verses from Psalm 113 to Psalm 118. It was the Hallel that the people quoted as they cried out 4 days earlier, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." It is also in the Hallel that we read, "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone," a passage on which Jesus preached during this last week of his life. I cannot help but wonder if Jesus drew particular comfort from these verses as he and his disciples sang this ancient hymn before walking to the Garden of Gethsemane. Out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me in a broad place. With the Lord on my side, I do not fear. What can mortals do to me? I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of the Lord. I was pushed hard so that I was falling, but the Lord helped me. The Lord is my strength and my might. He has become my salvation. I suspect these words continued to echo in Jesus' mind as he prayed that night in the garden. Jesus turned regularly to the Psalms, drawing from them throughout his public ministry. He taught from the Psalms, he sang from the Psalms at the Last Supper, and it was the Psalms that he prayed as he hung on the cross. Clearly, they were an important part of his spiritual life. If we seek to learn spiritually from Jesus, we will want to become familiar with the Psalms. Like Jesus, we will draw comfort from selected verses. The Gospels do not show him reciting entire psalms, but rather choosing this or that verse, often drawing on beautiful, noble, and lofty verses nestled among less noble, even vengeful verses in particular psalms. The Psalms represent the heart and soul of the Bible. and Jesus' use of them during the last 24 hours of his life beckons us to become more familiar with them. A good starting point might be to read Psalm 118 in its entirety, imagining what these words may have meant to Jesus as he sang them on that agonizing night. Good suggestion. After leaving the upper room, Jesus led his disciples east and then north on the road that ran along the Kidron Valley. On their right were the tombs of priests, prophets, and ordinary people who were buried there, facing Jerusalem. The Kidron Valley is also called the Valley of Jehoshaphat, and in Joel 3:12 it is identified as the site of the Last Judgment. Let the nations rouse themselves and come up to the Valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge. This valley represents the place where all the nations of the earth will one day be gathered to be judged by the one who, on this tragic night, led his disciples along the dark road. Surely this fact would not have been lost on Jesus. At the Last Supper, Jesus had predicted that one of the disciples would betray him. Now, as he walked with his friends, Jesus predicted that all of them would desert him. This prediction captures one part of the grief that Jesus experienced that night. He knew Jesus had already sold him out for 30 pieces of silver and would soon betray him with a kiss. He knew the disciples would all desert him, fleeing to protect their own lives. He knew that Peter, despite his protestations to the contrary, would deny even knowing him. The experience of being betrayed, deserted, and denied by his closest friends, this would produce great sorrow in any man. It was doubly true for Jesus, because these were his closest companions, men who had been with him for 3 years, who saw him work miracles and heard him preach. I am strangely grateful that the gospel writers included this information, rather than glossing over what was surely an embarrassing testimony concerning the disciples. The very fact that they failed the Lord helps me trust that there's grace yet for me when I deny, desert, and betray him. The comfort I draw from the story is not simply that even those closest to Jesus failed him, but that Jesus knew this would happen. Following his prediction that they would fall away, Jesus looked beyond their betrayal and said, "After I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." He anticipated their desertion, but he also foretold their restitution, their restoration. He would take them back despite the fact that they would forsake him. And if he did this for them, he'll do this for me and for you. At the base of the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Kidron Valley, sits a grove of olive trees called the Garden of Gethsemane. The garden looks directly onto the east wall of the Temple Mount, upon what is known as the Golden Gate, or the Beautiful Gate, an entrance sealed in 1541 by Sultan Suleiman I. This gate is described in Ezekiel 44 as the place where a prince would one day enter the temple courts. Is it possible that Jesus chose to come here to pray for this very reason? Today, the Garden of Gethsemane includes several very old olive trees. Some suggest these trees date from the time of Jesus, but as with many things in the Holy Land, others dispute this. Regardless, these trees have stood for hundreds of years, reminding pilgrims of the night when Jesus prayed here. Nearby sits the Church of All Nations, built atop previous churches to commemorate both Jesus' agony in the garden and the site of the final judgment. The church takes its name from Joel and his reference to the nations gathering for that momentous event. Entering the church, you can visualize that night when Jesus and his disciples came to the garden to pray. The church is darkened, stars dot the ceiling. At the chancel, a short iron fence surrounds a large stone outcropping. Tradition holds that this is the very place Jesus prayed that night as he awaited his arrest. Modern pilgrims can kneel to pray around the rock and can even touch it. It is a moving experience meant to take the worshiper back to that first Maundy Thursday. And an aside from me, I wish I had a way of showing you the pictures of these places as I was reading about them, because it would make it even more meaningful to you. And I know he has a DVD that accompanies this where he does that. He walks through and shows you. But it's well worth it if you would, if you wanted to listen to this again and on your computer screen, call up pictures of these places, Google them, and look at it. Okay, back to the book. To the north of the ancient trees in the Church of All Nations is a grove of younger olive trees. It is seldom visited, but it gives perhaps a better sense of what the garden may have looked like when Jesus and his disciples came to pray. Somewhere in the grove was an olive oil press, for this is the meaning of the word Gethsemane. John alone tells us that the place Jesus prayed was a garden. He alone tells us that the tomb where Jesus was buried was in a garden. and that Mary Magdalene first saw the risen Christ. When she first saw him, she thought he was a gardener. Perhaps John intends us to make the connection between what Jesus was doing and the events that took place in another garden at the very beginning of the Bible. God was the gardener who planted the garden called Eden, and it was in that garden that Adam and Eve disobeyed God and paradise was lost. John wants us to recognize that Jesus, unlike Adam, would be faithful to God. John also wants us to see that what Jesus was about to do was intended to address and reverse the effects of Adam and Eve's fall. In fact, Paul went so far as to speak of Jesus as the last Adam. John tells us Judas knew where to find Jesus on this night because Jesus often met there with his disciples. Luke writes that Jesus went to the Mount of Olives to pray that night, as was his custom. Why, we might ask, did Jesus often go to this place? Was it the beauty of the grove? Was it the fact that from this vantage point he could see the Temple Mount? Was it because David had gone up to the Mount of Olives near this place, weeping when he was betrayed by his son Absalom and his servant Ahithophel? Was it perhaps a way of connecting with the words of Zechariah the prophet concerning the Messiah? On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives. Or was this simply a peaceful and serene place where he felt particularly close to God? It was likely for all of these reasons. What we know for certain is that Jesus had regularly come to this place to pray, and it was to this place to which he returned when he was in his greatest anguish. As they entered Gethsemane, Jesus asked his disciples to watch and pray. Then he took Peter, James, and John with him a bit farther into the garden. He did not speak of or display his anguish until he was alone with his three closest companions. It is possible that he felt the need to be strong for the others and to keep them from seeing his torment, while still needing to share it with someone. Perhaps he felt these three might be able to understand. Most of us know how difficult it is to be strong for others, yet we are hesitant to reveal those moments when we are afraid, angry, or grieving. Still, we all need close companions with whom we can share such feelings. We need our Peter, James, and John. Often, like Jesus with his companions, we do not need our friends to say anything in our times of sorrow. Jesus did not ask Peter, James, or John for advice or even for words of encouragement. Like us, he just wanted to know they were there. Finally, Jesus began to reveal what he was feeling. Matthew tells us he began to be grieved and agitated. Jesus told them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." He then went a few paces further and threw himself on the ground to pray. After a short time, he came back to his friends. Did Jesus need to talk with them or simply to know they were with him? We don't know. We do know he found them sleeping, and his disappointment was clear. He asked Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour?" It was in this context that Jesus spoke those famous words that serve perhaps not so much as a warning, but as a note of grace to his friends. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Here I find myself again identifying with the disciples. This part of the story is powerful precisely because we can all imagine ourselves after midnight, falling asleep when Jesus needs us to be awake and in prayer. Besides offering us grace, this small detail increases the sense that Jesus would drink from the cup of suffering alone. The idea that Jesus was in anguish, pleading with God, is unsettling to many Christians. For some, the scene evokes great compassion. For others, the image of Jesus asking God to take the cup of suffering from him and his apparent anxiety over the crucifixion seems to lack nobility and courage. For still others, the image may even appear to indicate a lack of faith. They would perhaps expect Jesus to face his torture and death without agitation or fear. Interestingly, Luke reduces this story by half and seems to minimize Jesus' anguish, though a later editor seems to have added to Luke's gospel the detail that Jesus' sweat was like drops of blood, as though attempting to address Luke's minimalist approach. John does not include the story of Jesus' anguish at all. Some Christians, in explaining Jesus' agitation and sorrow in his later cry of dereliction from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" suggest it wasn't the result of fear or a lack of confidence in the plans of God or even a desire to avoid torture and death. Instead, their view of Gethsemane and Jesus' recitation from Psalm 22:1 from the cross reflects a particular view of the doctrine of the atonement. They suggest that when Jesus was hanging on the cross, God placed on him the sins of the world. At that moment, they teach, God turned his face away from Jesus, and there was for the first time a separation of the Father from the Son. It is said that this turning away was necessary because God is holy and could not look upon the sins of the world when they were placed upon his Son. According to this view, it was this turning away that led Jesus to feel abandoned on the cross, and the foreknowledge of this separation that led Jesus to be in such anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane. This is a compelling idea, but I believe it misrepresents what occurred on the cross and diminishes the character of God. While we speak of Jesus bearing the sins of the world on the cross, the idea is not that the Father literally covered Jesus with the world's sins. The idea is that the punishment those sins merited was voluntarily taken by Jesus on the cross. He suffered for sins he didn't commit in order to reconcile us to God. There was no reason for the Father to turn away. This was, in fact, the greatest act of sacrificial love imaginable and part of God's own plan. God did not look away, but instead looked with love and anguish at the suffering of his Son. God was grieved by it, seeing in the suffering and death of Jesus his Son's effort to draw the world to God. By watching this act, the Father joined in the suffering of the Son during those hours on the cross. But why then was Jesus distressed and anguished? Let's consider several reasons, each of which offers insight into the meaning of Gethsemane. Jesus may have experienced anguish because he was wrestling once more with the tempter, the same tempter who sought to lead him away from the cross when he began his ministry. Perhaps Jesus could hear the devil whispering, "Are you sure you're the Son of God? If you're not, you'll be throwing your life away." Or maybe, would God really want his Son to die? Surely this can't be his will. You've misunderstood. Or maybe the tempter whispered, "Are you sure there's not some other way? You're only 33. You've got so much more you could do with your life. Flee now. You still have time." Or simply tell them what they want to hear and they'll let you go. The mental and spiritual turmoil of such temptation would have been great. Jesus was being offered freedom from suffering. How easy it would have been to justify a decision to bypass the cross. Can you imagine the thoughts running through his mind? How many more could be touched if he lived? And the disciples, look at them, they were sleeping. They weren't ready to lead this work. What if the mission ended with the cross? Would it all have been for nothing? Is it a coincidence that Jesus prayed 3 times for the cup to pass from him? Or was this meant to remind us of the 3 temptations in the wilderness? We've already noted John's mention that Gethsemane was a garden, pointing us to Eden where others struggled and succumbed to the tempter. But here in Gethsemane, as in the wilderness 3 years earlier, Jesus withstood the temptation, this time praying to his Father, "Not my will, but yours be done." There's a second possible explanation for Jesus' anguish, or at least an additional element that added to it. His knowledge of Jerusalem's fate if the conflict with the Jewish leaders was brought to a head this way. If Jesus died, most people would not see him as the Messiah. They would continue to search for another. They would not understand that God wanted them to love their enemies, and they would await a Messiah who would lead them in attempting to overthrow the Romans. They would not have to wait long. 30 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, those searching for a military Messiah would find a man who would lead them in a war against the Romans. Roman reaction would be swift and furious. During the period from 66 to 73 AD, the Romans would crush the Jewish people, killing over 1 million Jews and their supporters. Jerusalem would be laid waste, the temple destroyed. Jesus knew this was in store for the Jewish people if he was crucified. Could this too have weighed heavily on his heart that night? Keep in mind that he chose to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, from which he could look upon the holy city. He could see the temple from there, a temple that was going to be destroyed. If this seems a bit far-fetched, consider the only time in Luke's gospel when Jesus wept. It occurred 4 days earlier on Palm Sunday. Jesus was coming down the Mount of Olives, and here's how Luke describes the scene. It's Luke 19. As he came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "If you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace. But now they're hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God." Recall that just hours before, Jesus stood at the Temple Mount predicting that not one stone will be left here upon another, and he offered his little apocalypse, which described in such vivid detail the destruction of Jerusalem. In the garden, he grieved not only for himself, but also for what would happen to the city, as he asked whether he was truly meant to drink from this cup. I believe these two explanations for Jesus' anguish may account for the suffering he experienced, but we dare not miss the reason for his agony in the garden. Can we allow Jesus to be a person? Hasn't the church always asserted that in Jesus God had become fully human? Did Paul not say that in Jesus the Son had emptied himself of his divinity in some meaningful sense? What would you be feeling if you knew that within a few hours you would be tortured, publicly humiliated, and then subject to one of the cruelest, most inhumane, painful forms of capital punishment ever devised by human beings? What if you knew that your death would leave open the possibility that terrible atrocities would be committed that you might have prevented? Can you sense the anguish Jesus might have felt? In the coming chapters, we'll explore the nature of the humiliation, torture, and death that awaited Jesus after he drank this cup. As a person, he had good reason to feel deeply grieved, even to death. Each of us knows what it's like to sense that God wants us to do something we don't want to do. We may feel called to take on a new ministry, to leave behind an unhealthy relationship, or to give a sacrificial gift to an organization. It may be a short-term or a long-term call to the mission field, or it could be a call to serve and love others outside our comfort zone. One of my parishioners felt called to teach the Alpha course, an introduction to Christian faith, in a federal penitentiary. But the first time she approached the security gates and barbed wire fence at Leavenworth Penitentiary, and then entered to meet the federal prisoners, she was terrified and wanted to back out. Another parishioner felt God calling her to leave her corporate job to go into the mission field in Honduras. Another felt compelled to start a ministry to the homeless. Still another was certain God was calling him to adopt a child from foster care. Each of these people had moments of anxiety related to answering God's call, and each ultimately prayed as Jesus prayed, "Not what I want, but what you want." This prayer captures the essence of complete trust. It is bold enough to lay before God our desires and humble and obedient enough to reassert that we'll do whatever God calls us to do, no matter the cost. Among the prayers I offer most mornings is the covenant prayer in the Wesleyan tradition. It begins, "I am no longer my own, but thine. Put me to what thou wilt." In other words, not what I want, but what you want. This simple prayer of obedience and trust goes a long way toward bringing us peace. Through it, Jesus teaches us that it's acceptable to tell God what we hope and desire. It's okay to tell God what you want. But the final word in our prayer is to be simple trust and submission to God's will. Yet not what I want, but what you want. Let us turn to the final part of this episode, which occurred sometime between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning. At that time, Judas, one of the 12, arrived in the garden, leading those sent by the religious authorities to arrest Jesus. By taking Jesus at night, the authorities avoided the potential of an uprising against them. Jesus knew the arrest was coming. He even knew that his friend Jesus would betray him. But what must Jesus have felt when he saw Judas coming toward him? The imagery is so powerful that 2,000 years later, the name Judas continues to be synonymous with traitor. Why did Judas betray Jesus? Much has been written on this subject. Some believe he sought to force Jesus to action, anticipating he would raise an army and lead the revolution Judas expected. Others believe he was disillusioned with Jesus, and still others believe he was simply greedy for gain. The gospel writers do tell us that whatever his motive, Judas was filled with grief following Jesus' arrest and trial, and that he took his own life after the crucifixion. Judas is such a tragic figure, and each of us has been a Judas, both to Jesus and to others. It has been noted that Judas himself must have been conflicted and in agony on that night. The sign he chose by which he betrayed Jesus was a kiss. The Greek word for kiss that's used here is philane, a word used to describe true affection for another. Judas loved Jesus, but he was willing to betray him. He loved him, but he resented him. He loved him, but he was frustrated by him. He loved him, but he sold him for 30 pieces of silver. Some have suggested that Jesus forgave Judas in the end, and that Judas stands in heaven as the ultimate sign of the grace of God. Others disagree. What do you think? Had Judas asked for mercy from Jesus, would Jesus have given it? As the arrest unfolded, Peter drew a sword and struck the high priest's servant's ear. John identifies him by the name Malchus. Luke the physician tells us that Jesus healed the man's ear, and I love this little fact. On the eve of his own torture and crucifixion, Jesus paused to heal a man sent to arrest him. He then commanded the disciples to put away their swords, saying, "For all who take the sword will perish by the sword." After the arrest, Jesus was bound by the club-wielding band. As their teacher was shackled, the disciples took flight. Mark tells us, in what some believe is an autobiographical allusion, that a young man who followed Jesus was with the disciples in the garden. As he fled, someone tried to seize him by his robe. He ran with such fervor that he left the robe behind and went naked into the darkness. Jesus stood watching as all his disciples deserted him. Only Judas remained. Judas had been betrayed with a kiss, then deserted by his friends, and his suffering was only beginning. Friends, it's been a pleasure and a blessing for me to be able to share this with you tonight. I'll be back tomorrow for the daily update at 7, and then back with Adam Hamilton at 8, and I hope you will tune in. God bless you and have a good night.